Did I ever tell you the story of Jimmy Briste, the great clown? Oh, Jimmy was a marvellous clown. He could make anybody laugh. He could make boys and girls or mothers and fathers. He could make grandpas and granddads laugh and laugh and laugh. He could even make the elephants and the horses in the circus laugh. Jimmy used to come in and everybody would applaud because he had such a wonderful face, kind and generous. And he was always falling over. That's what made the people laugh more than anything. When he climbed up a ladder and he fell down again. Or when he was crossing the tightrope and he fell off the tightrope. Or when he was on the horses and he pretended to fall off. But Jimmy hurt himself. Oh, Jimmy broke many bones in his body just so that he could hear the laughter of the people in the circus and when he came onto the stage. He broke so many bones in his body that soon he became too old and too worn to continue. That's why he was called Jimmy Briste. Briste in Irish means broke. And Jimmy was broken, every bone in his body. So he had to leave the circus and entertaining people and travelling the world. And he settled down to live in a small cabin by a river. And the river was called the Bradán. Now there's an Irish word for you, Bradán. It means salmon, because there was so much salmon in the river, they called it Owen Bradán. And that's where Jimmy lived on his own, lonely, and he was soon forgotten. Now on the other side of the river, there was a hill, a very steep hill going up to a castle. And in the castle lived the king. And the king was loved by all the people. And he loved his people too. And they were very happy. And he was very happy too, because there's nothing that makes you more happy than to know that the people are happy too. Everybody was happy. No, I'm wrong. Not everybody. There was one person the king loved most, but was most unhappy. And that was his daughter, the Princess Mánlín. Oh, she had once been happy, but gradually, sooner and later, she began to get very sad. And she stopped playing, and she stopped walking in the gardens, and she stopped eating, and she stopped smiling and laughing, and became very sad. And that made the king sad. And of course, when the king was sad, all the people became sad. And he sent for all the minstrels, for all the actors, for all the musicians, for all the dancers, and for all the storytellers to come and try to make Mánlín laugh and smile again. But none of them succeeded. Now one day, as often happens, something unforeseen happened. Polly, the cook who made the bread down in the kitchen of the palace, was reading an old newspaper, a very old newspaper one day, and she saw a picture in it that made her smile. It was of a wonderful face, friendly and kind, and underneath was something written which said, Jimmy Briste, the great clown, retires. And she looked at the picture and she thought, I know that face. Now, where did I see that face before? But she couldn't remember. So she went on cooking during the morning. And finally she remembered, I know, that's the old man who lives down by the river, by the Bradán. He never talks to many people and nobody ever goes to see him. That must be Jimmy Briste, the great clown. I'll run and tell the king. So she went up and she told the butler, and the butler told the king. And the king said, you mean we have a wonderful clown living down below the palace who could help my daughter Mánlín laugh again? Go and send for him straight away. So the butler hopped up on his bicycle and down the hill he went like the hammers of hell. And he came to the cabin of Jimmy and he rapped on the door. And Jimmy heard that and he said, oh, who could that be? I mean, nobody ever comes to visit me. And he went to the door, and when he saw somebody there, he smiled. And of course, the butler explained to Jimmy what he wanted, that the daughter was sad and needed somebody, and as he was a great clown, would he come up and make her laugh. But Jimmy just went silent, and a tear came to his eye, and he said, "Come over here." And he brought him over to a big trunk. And he opened up the trunk. And out from the trunk came the smell of circus, grease paint, and his makeup, and his old clown costumes, and his musical instruments, and little boxes as well. And he said to the butler, he says, "Do you see that? No life in them. There's no magic there. They're all tired and old and worn and broken, like me." He says, "I'm very sorry, but I couldn't make anybody laugh anymore." Well, the butler went back on his bicycle and up to the hill and told the king. And the king felt very sad because there was nothing he can do. And Jimmy, that night, got into bed, and he lay down on his bed, and he thought, and he thought, and he thought, and very soon Jimmy began to fall asleep, fall asleep. You know, I'm after falling asleep myself telling the story, and I didn't want to finish it there. Where was it? Oh, yes. Jimmy had gone into bed and he fell asleep, but he didn't sleep for long. He kept worrying and thinking about Mánlín because he hated to leave some person without a smile on their face. And he walked around his cabin all night. And then he went over to the trunk and he looked at the trunk, and then he went back again, and then he looked at the trunk again, until finally he raised the trunk again and he put his hands in and he took out a coloured box. And he opened the box and he looked inside and smiled. And out from the box he took what? He took the red nose. The red nose he always used as a clown. The red nose that had made so many people laugh. And he thought, how can I not go up and try to make that young woman laugh? How can I not be a clown? How can I not do what I was meant to do in life? I'm broken, but my heart is not broken. So he took off the nose and he lay down. And he thought, and he thought, and he thought. Now, the next morning, there was a surprise at the palace gates, because up the road the guards saw this strange character. Well, he was limping along, he was hardly able to walk, and he looked and he said, "What can I do for you?" And Jimmy looked at him and he said, "I want to see Mánlín." "Mánlín," said the guard. "You're talking about the princess. You don't say Mánlín, you say princess." "Look," he said, Jimmy said to the guard. "Look," he said, "I'm here to see a young woman called Mánlín. Now, will you go and tell the king that Jimmy Briste is here?" Well, word got round the palace very quickly that Jimmy Briste was at the gates. So the king sent down the butler, and the butler brought Jimmy up to meet the king. And the king told him the story. And then he brought him over to the gardens of the palace. And they all looked in, and there, seated under an old oak tree, was Mánlín. And her shoulders were hunched over, and her eyes were fixed on the ground. And she looked very, very sad. Very, very sad indeed. And the king looked at Jimmy, and he said, please make her laugh and make her smile. So Jimmy took out his red nose, put it on his face, and walked over and sat down on the bench beside Mánlín. And he put on his funniest faces, and he looked at her, and he looked this way, and he looked that way, and he looked. But Mánlín never even raised her head to look at him. So he put his hand in his pocket, and he took out some crumbs of bread, and he started throwing the crumbs of bread on the ground, and all the birds came over and started eating it, and he looked at her again, and Mánlín just looked at the birds and then looked away again. Then she looked up at Jimmy with such a sad face, and the two of them looked at each other, and then she looked back down again. And then Jimmy did something that no clown ever does. He took off his red nose, and he started to talk to Mánlín about himself. And he turned and he said, still looking at the birds, he said, "My name is Jimmy Briste. I was a clown once. I travelled the world, making people laugh and making people smile. But now there's nobody to make me laugh or smile. But I was all over the place with people, and I did everything." And he began to talk about the times he had and the countries he went to and the boys and girls he met and spoke to, and the time when the lion tamer fell down in the cage and the lion was coming towards him, and Jimmy jumped into the cage and he saved him from the lion, and the time the elephants got very restless and it was Jimmy who played his music to stop them from hurting anybody. And Jimmy spoke and spoke and spoke about all this. And gradually, Mánlín stopped looking at the ground and turned around and looked into Jimmy's face. And she started to look at his eyes. And he looked at her and he smiled. And he began to talk again about his whole life and how important it was for him to have made so many people laugh. And suddenly, Mánlín turned round and said, "Thank you." And a little smile came into her face. "Thank you for telling me your story, Jimmy Briste." And then she started to tell him about herself. But Jimmy was getting very tired and very sleepy again, and she realised this. So she said, putting her little gentle hand on his arm, she said, "Will you come back and talk to me tomorrow, please?" And Jimmy said, Yes, I'll be here, Mánlín, any time you want me." And off she skipped across the garden. And when the king saw this, he was so amazed. And Jimmy fell asleep there on the bench. And the next day, when Mánlín went back, Jimmy was still sitting on the bench and he was feeding the birds again. And she said, "Tell me some more of your story and I'll tell you some of mine." But Jimmy said, "Well, you tell me some of your story first." And then Mánlín began to tell Jimmy the fact that she was sad because nobody in the palace ever treated her like she was. They all started to say yes to her and always did what she wanted them to do. But she felt they were not her friends, that they didn't know who she really was. And she felt sad and lonely, and lonelier and lonelier as the time passed by. And she realised that being a princess wasn't very nice after all, because she wanted to tell people about the time she was sad, about the time she was happy, and she wanted to talk to them all the time as a person. And she told Jimmy that they were not treating her as a person in the palace, and that's why she was sad. Well, Jimmy continued telling her his story, and they both chatted away and spoke, and each time they looked into each other's eyes and they could see that they were both talking to each other as people, as persons, because that's what we want most, isn't it? To talk to people, to be with people. And Jimmy was doing that with Mánlín Bán. And the king was happy, and the people were happy. And time went on, and the weeks passed. And Mánlín Bán every day went into the garden and met Jimmy, and they spoke and spoke for weeks, and they became the best of friends. Until one day, Mánlín Bán went out into the garden, and she looked across, and lying on the bench, sitting with his head against the tree, was Jimmy. And Jimmy had his eyes closed, and he had his red nose on this time. And he had the happiest smile on his face. And the smile on his face was from the happiness of having given one last great performance to make someone laugh. And that person that he made laugh was a young girl called Mánlín Bán, who promised him that whenever she thought of him, she would always keep a smile on her face. And that's the story of Jimmy Briste and the princess who was called Mánlín Bán. Oh, the gypsy rover came over the hill, down to the valley so shady. He whistled and he sang till the greenwoods rang, and he won the heart of the lady. Ha-dee-doo, ha-dee-doo, da-day. Ha-dee-doo, ha-dee-day.